Okay, so welcome to Kiran Yoga Podcast. Today's guest is Reema Datta. It's a pleasure to have you, Reema.
Thanks
Welcome.
for having me. Thank you.
So we were just discussing before. Often the most interesting stuff happens before we start the interview, and and then how to introduce Reema today. And she suggested she practices in many different ways. So maybe we take it from there. The obvious question is always how did you start, and where do you find your practice today? So I know you've got an interesting journey with yoga that spans a professional career in the UN as well. I'd love to hear a little bit about that and your background, and then how you found yourself into becoming a yoga teacher, much to the disappointment of your parents, I believe. So,
yeah.
Yeah. Well,
that's accurate.
Yeah, my parents were pretty disappointed at the start as well, to be honest. Anyway, it's over to you. Yeah, let us know a little bit about you.
Yeah, well, I kind of just was born into it. You know, my mom sings mantra, and so I've literally been hearing her sing mantra since I was in her womb. And they became my childhood lullabies. So that was a big part of growing up, is listening to her and her sisters and my grandmothers singing mantra, and Ayurveda was a part of our lives. So just, I was being fed Ayurvedic food. I didn't realize how spoiled I was until I went to college, because my mom literally made breakfast, lunch, dinner from scratch, Ayurvedic Indian food every day. So when I went to college, I was like, oh my gosh, it's bad.
Everyone doesn't
here.
eat like this. Yeah. Trying to make a burger, somehow balancing the kind of the qualities of a fast food meal. Where was that you grew up?
In Maryland. I grew up in Maryland, and we lived in Michigan for a while. And then actually, when I was 8 years old, my family, we moved back to India. So I spent some years in India, elementary and some middle school. It was supposed to be a permanent move back, because my parents were homesick and they felt like, okay, we experienced America, now we're done. And now let's go back to India. So it was like we shipped everything back to India. But then we ended up, after some years, returning to the States. And so I had some years growing up there. But also, while I was growing up, my grandfather, he has a huge passion for yoga and yoga philosophy. So, and he used to give lectures on the Gita and the Vedas and the Upanishads. So I grew up hearing him, and he was a very inspiring orator and just a dynamic person. So he was kind of my first teacher of the philosophy, the Vedic philosophy.
And he had a retreat as well. You brought some students to later on, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I did that retreat with Danny Paradise. We together brought. Okay. Oh yeah, with it was like 2005 when we did that, right. And about 23 guests we had, mostly Europeans and a couple Americans. And it was wonderful, to go to my grandfather's village, and we did asana every day, but we also sang mantra every day and talked philosophy, and went to the farms in the village, and we practiced with the villagers and just had a great time.
But they were practicing asana as well, were they?
They were, yeah.
Were they?
And some of them, yeah. I mean, we were practicing pretty, first series, second series, and some of the villagers had never practiced those kind of sequences. But, they sit on the floor all day, they're strong, and they were practicing like no problem.
I bet you they could do it, yeah.
Everything.
I know. I just say it's a funny story. I worked at Purple Valley many years ago. That's how I met my wife, actually. And I used to work in the gardens sometimes in the monsoon with workers in the gardens, local workers, right? And then they would say, what are you doing down there, with the yoga and stuff? So I'd show them a couple of things, and they could immediately do them. no practice at all. I remember there's this one. I have a picture of one of the gardeners saying, "Oh, look at what I can do," and he puts his leg behind his head, stands up, so he's in Asana with a leg behind the head, standing up, no warm up, nothing. No, I never done it before,
Wow.
I would not say all people are like that, but there's a natural propensity for a good level of flexibility, and obviously traditionally they're working hard, they're working manually and have a much more conducive lifestyle, let's say, to being healthy than us today, where you have to just go to the gym to get any exercise or practice yoga.
Right. I mean, asana gets a bad name these days, but I actually think in a way it's more important than ever because our lifestyles have become so sedentary that I hope people are doing asana too, So, I mean, some of my family members who are more bhakti yogis or jnana yogis, I encourage them to do asana. So I'm like on the other side of the spectrum with some of the conversations, So
how did you get to from the mantra and from because I often argue this that there's so much culture around yoga as it's done in India, and then obviously in the West you have this rather exclusive and kind of singular taking of asana and using it as yoga itself. And how did you get into the asana from a kind of a much wider cultural context? I think you would have had, what grabbed you with that?
When I was living in New York City, I was working for the UN, and in the evenings and the weekends, I started going to yoga studios. And that was actually my first experience with yoga in the Western world because I had always practiced at home. And even, my mom does some asana, even though she does more mantra and other aspects of yoga. But I've always loved movement. So when I went to the studios, I actually really enjoyed the movement. But I also noticed, that the other elements were missing. And then I was working at the UN when 9/11 happened. And that was kind of a turning point for me because I was in the evenings, like going to yoga classes and I was listening, going back to the philosophy. And just this one line I heard a teacher say, one of my teachers, and it really hit me. And he said that there's violence in the world because there's violence in our minds, and it just brought me back to some of the Vedic teachings. If you see the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, it's all about the mind, actually. How to overcome the destructive tendencies of our mind and come to a place of peace within. And then, of course, that radiates out, and the outer world is a reflection of what's happening inside. So I just felt the truth of this phenomenon that peace really has to start inside. And I had a lot of internal conflicts at that time. I was in my early 20s and just didn't feel like I was really doing what I was born to do. The UN was very interesting, but I was more interested in the healing arts and yoga and the power of these practices. And New York was so intense after 9/11. I actually went to San Francisco just to visit a friend, actually. And I had a couple of friends there, and they were telling me you should really try out the West Coast because it's completely different and it's more. They were like, you would like it here, so you should really try. So I went there, and the first few days I was in San Francisco, I would just walk. Like every day, I just walked the city because it's a very walkable city. And one day I saw this sign, and it was like downtown San Francisco, and the sign was a yoga studio. And I just felt drawn to it. And I had some experience with yoga studios in New York, but not a lot. So I went up, the studio was like on the second floor, and it was just one big room. And it was like 40 people in this room, and they were actually practicing Ashtanga. And I had never seen that sequence, primary series. And
where was that?
And it was called
Remember
It's
who
Yoga.
That was with? It's
Larry
Yoga.
Schultz, he owned
Oh, with Larry,
It's
right? Okay, so it was a kind of, I mean, he was doing the kind of fusion of like Ashtanga, his rockets.
It was his rocket, but based on Ashtanga,
Kind of
that just that
Ashtanga, really,
strong,
isn't it? With the extra arm balances and extra kind of dynamism added in.
Yes, very rooted in Ashtanga. So it was the rocket. But I hadn't experienced like Patabi Joyce's Ashtanga yoga, so it was new for me.
Yeah.
I understood Ashtanga yoga as the 8 limbs, but I wasn't familiar with Patabi Joyce's sequences.
Yes,
but
that confuses
many. Right. So this class, it was like in the middle of the class, everyone's sweating and just in sync. And to me, it was extraordinarily beautiful, just to see these strong people. Like, it was clearly a moving meditation, and they were just the energy was just beautiful. And I was actually like, wow, like what are they doing? I want to learn that, So the next day I went back to the studio and I spoke with, the people at the desk and the people working there. And I said, I came here last night. Like, what were you doing? And they said, oh, this is Ashtanga yoga. It's a particular sequence. It's based on a particular sequence.
Yeah.
I had never heard of Patabi Joyce. Even though I have so much yoga background from my family, I had never heard of Patabi or the style of Ashtanga yoga.
Did you relate the two to, and you said it was beautiful and like a meditation, but how would that, I kind of can't imagine how you would rate that to the yoga of your background, knowing, and having kind of been in India a little bit, obviously, not having any kind of cultural background like you do. Nevertheless, it's a bit challenging to relate the two together, hearing your mum, sing the mantra and and growing up with an appreciation of the philosophy and Ayurveda and all these things. And then, you get that. And it's like, could you make a connection though? Did you still feel, I mean, on a personal level, did you still feel it was something to do with what you'd been exposed to in younger life?
Yeah, I could, there was devotion in the room.
Right.
I could feel that. And people were synced with their breath. And which is interesting because now, like, sometimes I go to studios and I'm like, the students aren't even breathing. Like, they're not even aware of the breath, even if there's all these asana movement going on. But I think actually that studio, there were very good teachers because there was that link between breath and movement, and there was that feeling of devotion and community. And I was actually taken aback by the beauty of it. And so I ended up, I had decided to leave the UN and try out San Francisco. So I thought I was in this in-between stage between jobs because I let go of my job in New York, but I was going to find a job in San Francisco. But I thought, like, let me treat myself because my whole life I've been doing schoolwork. So, and they had, when I went and the next day to talk to the people at the studio, and I told them I want to learn the sequence. And they said, well, we have a 1-month teacher training coming up. You're welcome to take it. And I was very clear. I said, I have no intention to teach. I just want to learn the sequence for my own, sake. And they said, that's no problem. Half of our students never teach. So I said, okay. So I took it. And it was a beautiful, wonderful experience. And at the end of the month, I actually wrote Larry a letter. And I said, thank you. That was such a fantastic experience. Did
you meet Larry on it? Was he on it?
He was the main teacher.
Right. Okay, right.
Yeah, and I just said thank you. That was wonderful. I just have a few suggestions of like things you could bring to your studio, and no intention for me to do it.
Yeah.
But I just wrote a list, and I said things like mantra, Ayurveda, subtle body philosophy, pranayama, and a list like that. And then the next day, he's, the chakras and just teaching all these other aspects. So the next day, he came to me and he said, would you meet me for lunch? And I said, sure. And he basically just offered me a job. He said, why don't you? He said, I've been wanting to bring all this to my studio for years, but I never had anyone to do that. So why don't you? And I kind of said no. I was like, we live in San Francisco. I'm sure there's like elders. I'll help you find someone. Because, in India, it's like it's usually elders who teach these topics, and which is one reason my family was so against me becoming a teacher, because I was so young, you know. I was only like 25 when I started teaching. And Larry just insisted. He said, no, I want you to do this. And so I said, okay. And I my first gig in yoga was actually, I gave some talks in his teacher training program. So I gave talks on mantra and the Gita and, you know, aspects of the subtle body and pranayama. And then we just started teaching some work. He hired me to write his second level teacher training manual. So, and which was actually wonderful for me, because I love all these topics. You know, I was like, really? Like, I'm going to get paid to read and write these topics that I love so much. So that's kind of how it started. And then I was doing all of that, like teaching all these other aspects of yoga at his studio. And then one day he said, I want you to teach beginner asana. And I said, no way. Dude, like, that's the one thing I won't do, because I was really new to that kind of, you know, asana flow. And again, he insisted. And so I reluctantly said, okay. And I was surprised. It felt very natural. And, you know, I just started to teach that as well. So he was really the reason, you know, to this day, I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. It's synchronistic, isn't it? How that just fell into your lap. I mean, I think a lot of people, I think especially on the older generation of teachers, as I say, older generation, like, you know, people of your era and mine as well, you know, it just kind of happened. I think nowadays it's so out there that you can kind of want it to happen, you know, but at the time it's like, I don't think a lot of us thought, I mean, you know, I'm sure you probably found it this yourself coming from a proper job, that there was any money in it, you know, like relative to what you probably had. There was no money. Yes, you got paid, but pittance probably, compared to, and, you know, and for me and for others it was, and so, you know, and you mentioned Danny Paradise, and I know you you have a connection with Danny, that, you know, it wasn't something you did for money. It was because you were basically a hippie or a hippie throwback, in my case, you know, just kind of feeling like, as you do in your 20s, that, you know, oh, you don't need money, that everyone can just learn yoga, and, you know, like, you know, maybe impractical or maybe idealistic, but certainly it came from, there was that mentality in that era, you know. And obviously, you know, the area that people like Danny and David Swenson come from, there really was that feeling of living in Maui and sharing all the food together and literally not having 2 pennies to rub together, kind of thing. And, you know, and that was fine, you know. Things have changed. Well, I mean, that after that long preamble, what was Larry like? I mean, many people don't know Larry of Rocket Yoga, so it'd be interesting just a brief reflection on Larry Schultz, because I think he did a big service to the yoga world in lots of ways, but I think he gets a bad rap in Ashtanga. The people think that he wasn't traditional, that he was rather materialistic in just putting it towards the arm balance and more dynamic versions of asana, that he wasn't quote unquote yogic, you know, so it doesn't sound that way from the way you describe him as a man. No,
that's not my experience. You know, and just that link of what I grew up with, you know, with Vedanta, and it's like that union we talk about with consciousness. It's like it's an expansive feeling, you know, like when you're really in union with consciousness, your mind is in an expansive state. So, and it's like, our creative energy is rising, right? Kundalini Shakti, which all this dormant, blocked energy at the base of the spine starts to stir and awaken when we practice yoga. So, like, coming from my family background, we celebrate creativity and expansion. You know, so I was coming in at it from that perspective. So for me, that's why I was like, wow, this is beautiful. Like, this strong yoga practice it's gorgeous. I found it gorgeous and a beautiful way to expand, you know, the traditional ways that I learned and what I was exposed to. So I'd never had that judgment with Larry, like, oh, he's changing a set sequence, because from my perspective, it's like, things are constantly evolving and changing, and yoga has evolved in India, even when it was just in India, So I never had that kind. I was aware. Then I learned about the Ashtanga world of Mysore, but I didn't come from that world, So I never had that. I was always just like beautiful to see the creativity, and on a very personal level. Because, I did practice asana with my mom, but it was very much just like a few poses and holding them, and not like a flow kind of practice. But so what I experienced when I worked at Larry's studio, I was the strongest I had ever been in my life, like so strong in my body. And I remember very like this moment because of course the body and the mind are connected. So I felt so strong in my mind. And because even when I started, when I did that training, the teacher training, I wasn't sure I was letting go of my life in New York and the UN. I was still kind of a little bit in limbo. And through that, by the end of that, just 1 month, but by the end of the training, I really made some pretty big decisions of the direction of my life, and just some relationships I changed. And, I decided to actually not go back to the UN. And I had that mental strength, and I remember very distinctly that, my whole life I learned about being Hindu, about all our gods and goddesses and all their qualities and their strength. But those, it was just like always these kind of abstract ideas and deities. And when I was doing that very, very strong asana practice, like 6 days a week and getting super strong in my body, it was the first time in my life that I felt those powers within myself. I was like, oh, like all the powers of all those gods and goddesses I grew up learning. Even though I grew up learning that all those energies are within us, it was the first time I actually had that like direct experience that, all these powerful energies are within me, because they were actually like the asana was helping me to loosen my blocks and get connected to my inner strength. And, it was actually very powerful for me.
I think you mentioned an interesting thing there, that there's often a lot of, kind of segueing onto another subject slightly, that there is often this kind of piety in the Western world brought to things like, yoga, which you don't necessarily find when you go to India and you see the celebratory nature of a festival or of anyone who's doing something dynamic and creative, right? And then there's this kind of feeling, well, yoga, it should be like this. And it's like, well, then there's a guy like Larry celebrating himself, basically celebrating his own energy, celebrating the potency of the human, condition, right. Why not, And in some respects, there's a kind of, in fact, a kind of Protestant kind of narrative being brought upon yoga, which is expansive, and very positive towards the body, very positive towards the human expression. If you look at the tantric roots of yoga, anyway, and that's kind of like dumbed down now in this, or it needs to be like this, and if it's not like this, then it can't be traditional yoga, and Larry isn't traditional because he's too focused on the asana, or and it brings me on to the subject that I got in touch with you first of all to talk about, which was the idea of appropriation in yoga culture. And a wonderful article I recommend anyone to read of Reema's. It's a short article, but very good, in the Elephant Journal, Yoga Journal. I think it's in 2022 you wrote it. Was that November 2022?
That sounds right.
It says on. Something like that. Yeah. Anyways, read it. It's easy to find, Reema Datta and the Elephant Journal article. And talking about yoga appropriation and a contrary voice, which I think is interesting and probably much needed, and saying, well, actually, Indians are quite happy with people trying, like the people came to your village, the villagers were happy with them trying to, you mentioned trying to speak a little Sanskrit or do yoga, even if it wasn't perfect, right? And there's another narrative which on the vein of appropriation, which is actually quite destructive, not only to the indigenous people, but, to Westerners and to them trying to find out more about the culture.
Hmm. Yeah, I think a couple of years ago it happened because I have traveled quite a bit through Europe and Asia teaching. So I have good friends, all over, and some of my good friends who I know are very sincere, beautiful teachers and practitioners, not of Indian descent, but have beautiful practices. And they started to contact me when some of the cultural appropriation dialogue was some of the angles people were taking were becoming popular. And I could see how hurt they were. And they were even asking me, should we stop teaching yoga? Like, should we
Have you
call
been
it something
thinking that?
else?
Have you been holding back all the time from telling us that we shouldn't be doing this? Right? Like,
Yeah. And
tell us to
I
stop.
know them. I know them personally. So and I know like these particular people are such beautiful teachers. And I was like, no, we need you. Don't turn away from the yoga world. And so I was I don't know. Some of those more popular voices made me feel bad, and just like I was actually, this doesn't actually represent um, how my
Your
family
experience.
sees this,
Yeah.
or my
Yeah.
experience, my
Mm-mm.
family's
Mm-mm.
experience, my parents, my grandparents, a couple generations. And so I just felt like representing a different voice. And it's not
Mm.
that we don't think that yoga has been misunderstood or even misrepresented, because I think, we would agree that there is a very much of a focus on asana, and there are a lot of yogis who aren't aware of the other aspects. And so I think we would agree that there's a need to, you know, help people understand all the dynamics of yoga, and especially the teachings about the mind and how we can use yoga to help us with anxiety and depression and all these things that are so important right now to address. So it's not that there isn't work to do and that there isn't some misrepresentation, but it's just that, like, let's work on it together with kindness and compassion and forgiveness and love, and not with this, like, not being divisive, because
Mm.
it's just makes me a little crazy because I just feel like if yogis become divisive, that scares me. Like, what hope do we have of this world? There's so much division and violence in the world. So if we as yogis are being divisive, and that's very disturbing to me. And that's why I
Yeah.
had to like write that article and be like, wait a second, like, let's not go down that road.
And potentially, as you mentioned, it can also turn you into a victim, a victim of
Yeah.
misrepresentation and disempower the people it's meant to empower. Obviously, that's a contrary
Mm-hmm.
angle to the whole thing, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, things have become polemical. Everyone's calling each other out, and essentially, it's just another form of one-upmanship or virtue signaling, isn't it? Really, a lot of the time, I'm not sure that the
Right.
people are even interested in the real subject. But on a deeper level, well, yoga has always evolved. And when you mentioned the qualities of devotion, stability, clarity of
Mm-hmm.
mind, I mean, these are ambiguous terms at the best of times. And perhaps they can be found in many different ways. And traditionally in India, if we talk of traditional, what is traditional yoga? They have been found in many different ways. It's a very, the subcontinent, geographically speaking, has given birth to many, many different incredible ways of
Mm-hmm.
finding oneself or communing with God or whatever whatever we want to call
Right.
it. It's been very diverse, and increasingly we're narrowing it down to it. If it's traditional, it has to be like this. But if you look,
Mm-hmm.
scratch the surface, you'll find a plethora of ways that this is done. Right? What would you say
Absolutely.
then? I
Yeah.
mean, is there anything that cannot be taken out of this? I mean, talking about what we can do then, what we can do for studios and for teachers, is there anything that you say, well, if it doesn't have because I often go on write posts and stuff about these things. If it's not this, then we cannot call it yoga. Is there anything that, you would say you'd like to see kind of in stone as, things to adhere to?
Yeah. Yeah. I get surprised sometimes because I have been a guest on many teacher training programs, and I think there can be a lot of work done at that level of teacher trainings, because I don't blame teachers who aren't Indian to not have teachings on things besides asana, because most teacher trainings, that's the bulk what's covered. So how can we blame teachers? But I think there's work to be done at that level of teacher training to bring in other subjects and to take time to learn, to read some of the texts, like the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and or if depending on who's teaching the training, maybe a Buddhist text. But what I find where I find there's a lot of room for improvement is bringing in the elements of the mind. How can we use these practices to, of course, when we practice asana or any style of yoga, like we're going to experience some peace of mind, right? In Shavasana, we're all pretty peaceful, but it's fleeting, right? It can go pretty fast. In a few minutes, all your problems come back. And if you're angry or sad, those emotions come back. So what I feel is that, like, let's spend time really with these texts because they really teach us how to experience a peace that's more lasting, but that requires more inner work, looking at our thoughts, looking at our emotions, learning how to shift the ones that are harmful. And those are very, like, those teachings are there in the Vedic texts, but I find that that's pretty much missing in the trainings and in our classes, which is so, I think people want that, and it could be really useful.
I think on a practical level, it's hard to find good practical translations of the text that are appropriate to modern everyday life. And you go back to reading the Vedas, good luck with that, or even some of the Upanishads, like, how are you going to do that? Or, or read the Yoga Sutras without the commentaries, that's open to a lot of interpretation. And then the Bhagavad Gita, if you don't get a modern translation, right, that language is pretty antiquated and, all the talk of the long-haired Krishna and the strong-armed Bhimsa and all that, it's, I think one difficulty is these texts perhaps need to be made more applicable and modern to a modern audience to kind of grab them, and this is the personal kind of mantle that I'm going on now, is to try and somehow do that, because they've got all the stuff there, but it's, we've just moved on. I mean, like, the modern, even in the last few years, the modern experience, is so different, so perhaps is that one reason is that difficulty of trying to translate these things to a modern context. And also, I mean, things like the Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha that people love to quote, how does that relate to daily life? I mean, that is stopping the mind. Like, so this Bible of yoga, the Bible of yoga that's wheeled in every teacher training is like, well, yes, it could be applicable, but we're going to have to do a bit of legwork to make Chitta Vritti a useful tenet in everyday life,
Yeah, I mean, Yoga Chitta, it's like, it's not just stopping the mind. It's literally like overcoming the harmful fluctuations of the mind. So when you look at the sutras, it's like, what are the fluctuations of the mind that are causing the most harm? Because our thoughts and our emotions, they create, granthis, as a Sanskrit word for knots or blocks. So there's a lot in the text about this mind-body connection, which I feel like we talk about yoga being mind, body, spirit, but I don't actually feel that we've grasped that as a yoga community. Because how do thoughts and emotions create blocks? Like, those teachings are there, like what types of thoughts and emotions create what types of knots and what parts of the subtle body, which then affect the gross body. And how, and like in this, the Yoga Sutras, they talk about kleshas, which are destructive emotions and thoughts. And like the major kleshas are anger, jealousy, attachment, anxiety, sorrow, confusion. And there are teachings of like, how do we look at these, like not just push them aside, but how do we actually face them? And how can we move through them and then eventually free ourselves of them? And I feel like now with, so many people struggling with anxiety and all these kinds of mental unrest, those teachings are actually really valuable. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe that's where some like representation is important, because I think there is something about growing up with these texts and, you know, hearing them for decades and decades since we were babies, that maybe that's like a window where it's nice to have someone, a guest teacher or something, someone come in who can explain these texts in ways that people can understand today.
Practical,
you know?
Yeah.
Because what happened with me, like I actually, as you know, I love asana and I love the physical aspect of the practice, but I've always been aware of the mind practices too, the mind trainings. But I did have some distance from them, like when I got into my 30s and just got busy with like teaching and traveling. And in my own personal life, like when things kind of fell apart, I went through a separation with the father of my child, and my mind actually spiraled down. And I experienced great amounts of anxiety and sorrow and these kleshas. So what I did is, you know, I must have been in my mid-30s then. I went back to the Gita and the Upanishads, and I read them again, you know, for the millionth time. But at least at that moment in my life, when I read them, it did speak to me in a different way, because I was suffering in my mind. I was really noticing the teachings of like how to face these kleshas, these disturbances in our mind, and like very specific, very useful teachings on how to overcome them. You know, so I started to bring them into my practices and teachings, and I
suppose perhaps the readiness is everything, really, and you know, maybe the asana that kind of keeps one in the ballpark, as it were, until there's a point in life where it's like, okay, the recognition of that the suffering is there as an inherent part of life becomes apparent to everyone, and that's when maybe then the readiness is there to really actually look and then unfortunately a lot of the trainings you talk about, mind trainings, etc., are more apparent in Buddhist practices, which is a shame that they are seen now as so divergent to yoga practices, because obviously they're not. They are very they're one and the same, really. That they come from the same source, and
exactly, yeah. And
they should be be brought in, rather than say, well, oh, that's Buddhist, it's not yoga, so you can't be a Buddhist in a yoga practice. So that's just a load of rubbish.
I totally agree, because I've seen that a lot in the yoga world today. There's like the Buddhists who are meditating, and then the yogis who are doing asana. But if you look at the Vedic texts, all those mind training techniques are there too. It's very similar to Buddhism, actually. So I feel like all those mental aspects were a part of yoga, like the original yoga teachings, and that has been lost. And so for us, for any like a yoga educator who's teaching teacher trainings or just in that role of educating people on yoga, I think it is important to just take a pause and one way or another find a teacher or find a translation that I can suggest some, but that are easy to read and understand, and start bringing those teachings into your trainings and your classes, and that is a better representation of yoga. Bringing in the mind.
So let me know a few things, and we'll put them in the footnotes of the show. And if you've got any recommendations for books that people might read, I'm sure they'd be super interested to hear them. I have a couple of favorite translations, and they can make all the difference, right? I remember getting my hands on the translation I like of the Bhagavad Gita, and for the first time, I was like, wow, that is a book I really like. Previous to that, it was like, I couldn't get past it. It was like a musty old battlefield. The language was old. It was like Winthrop Sargent or something. I couldn't get into it. But latterly I found one, it's probably a populist one. It's the translation is Stanley Lombardo's one. I say it to everyone that it's may not be the most exact translation perhaps, but it's one that gets you into the ideas of it. And that's the main thing, right? And, I suppose along those lines, like how exact does one need to be? Like, on talking about practicalities now, on going into a yoga studio, and often people say to me, like, as teachers, well, should we say the prayers? Should we say the prayers in Sanskrit if we can't pronounce them right? And what about this one? Someone often says this to me, who'll be very happy. I brought it up when if she's listening. Should I say Namaste to my students, because people call me out for saying Namaste at the start of a class, but I like to say Namaste. But other people say I shouldn't say that. Other things like positioning of a statue. People will turn the feet away, for example. They'll turn their feet away and do shavasana facing the statue. You mentioned not having the statue on the floor, for example. What kind of things might you say? Or another one I like is not using swear words. I think you call them curse words. Maybe that's American parlance. We call them swearing, not using swear words around yoga. And people like to say fucking all the time about this or that or the other, and it gets involved in yoga as well, doesn't it? So, let me know what you think we could do to make it, just more respectful, in terms of culturally respectful.
Yeah, I do think that is important, and I find that the people I know, like you, are asking the questions and would never do something disrespectful on purpose, which is again why I feel like I don't like those dialogues of like shaming and blaming, because if there's a mistake, like if there's a mistake and we can correct it, we don't have to put each other down, But yeah, I think it is, if you have a studio, to take some time to learn about like where to put the statues, what they represent, what the meaning of them. And we don't put our feet, close to them or towards them and things like that. It is nice to learn that and respect that. And so, as far as Sanskrit, it's tricky because, for me, and I'm sure my family would agree, but we're, with spirituality, things are just more on an energetic level, so for me, I would be more wondering, like, what's in this person's heart? What is their energy? What is their, rather than being caught up in like, oh, they mispronounced this particular word. So I think that's what matters is, if the teacher respects the language and the tradition and the culture and is happy to share a mantra or a chant, then share it. And if the pronunciation isn't perfect, it's okay. But again, if you're in the role of a teacher or an educator, I think it's good to take the time to learn. If you're doing the Vande Guru Nam chant every day for 2 decades, then, take the time to learn the pronunciation. And if it's still not perfect, it's okay. But just the effort, is, but I wouldn't discourage.
Go back to that again then.
I wouldn't discourage anyone, because what is the meaning of Namaste? Namaste is like, I'm not crazy about the translation, like the light in me.
Yes.
To the light in you, because with this philosophy, we're getting away from me and you. It's a unity, right? So I see Namaste as like, we bow to the light that connects us and reminds us that we're fundamentally the same. So did
you say that growing up?
I mean, that's the feeling. Right. But, I mean, we didn't say that because Namaste, yes. Yeah, we use the word Namaste. Oh, right, okay. Sure. Right. But but the feeling behind it is, it's like we're bowing to this light that connects us. It's not like mine and yours. and
right.
It's just that there's this one light that connects us, and I'm acknowledging it. And so like central to the philosophy is, in the Gita, they'll actually say like counter the separation that the mind creates between yourself and another, because that's what our minds do, right? They say, I am this and you are that. Like even yoga chitti vritti nirodha, yoga is that which we use to overcome the fluctuations of the mind, right? So, but what is, if you look deeper into the text, they'll say like, what is the biggest fluctuation of the mind? And it's this sentence, I am this and you are that. I am this, you are that. Like that fluctuation of the mind creates so much division. instead of saying, I bow to the light that connects us, or recognizing our common ground,
Yeah.
So, coming so deeply from that kind of philosophy, that's why it's hard for me to hear some of the dialogue around cultural appropriation, because it's so much like, oh, this is my culture, but that's not how my grandparents would see it. Like this like yoga was a gift to humanity. Like this is ours,
Kind of imagine, as we were speaking about before, that they're just kind of flattered and interested that people are appreciating it so much and spending so much time trying to learn it.
Right. So that's the bigger picture. It's like, wow, like you're interested. The world is interested in this beautiful healing practice. And then the other stuff is like small details, like, oh, their Sanskrit was mispronounced. Okay, well, we can work on that. It's
I mean, again, it comes down to the kind of idea of authenticity, doesn't it? Or, I mean, the same with kind of the Bhagavad Gita, intention is everything. If you're wearing the mala beads and saying namaste to simply to sell something to people and you feel that would be the right garb, like taking on a yoga uniform, then that's one thing. But if you're doing it because you feel like that and you really, ensconcing yourself in a tradition, that's another thing. It's a completely different thing, isn't it? So it's, it's about intentionality and it's very hard to judge what someone's intentionality is, apart from you get an intuition sometimes, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I mean, I think at most we can be concerned about ourselves, our own intention and, what we're giving our students rather than looking and blaming and judging. It's like, let me, be the most authentic and
that'd be nice.
Teach with as much integrity as I can. Yeah. Because to be honest, I mean, I'm sure I've been teaching now, I don't know, for I think I'm going on 22 or 23 years. I'm 47 and I still am refining my teaching, so it's like for all of us, there's room for improvement and there's room for learning. And so I feel like it's good to acknowledge that there are some imbalances, in the yoga world, and there's room for improvement. But like, let's do that. Let's improve the representation of yoga together.
In a more supportive and positive way, rather than just putting each other down, which tends to happen. But that's a spirit of commercialism there as well, isn't it? How are you? Just to wrap this up now. What are you doing with your yoga now? I mean, you mentioned you had a background in obviously the rocket, and you've done some Ashtanga, I know. And then you mentioned you're doing some sequences now for different emotions, or working on different emotions. Let the listeners just know, like, what kind of thing. I've done it for long enough. I should know by now. What kind of thing you're doing on these days in terms of your practice? How has it evolved these days?
Yeah, when I went back to the texts, like the Upanishads, they have very detailed teachings of the koshas, the subtle body, the layers of our being, the vayus, which are our inner winds, the chakras, and how our thoughts and emotions affect our subtle body. And so what I started doing, and I did this for myself because I was struggling with some of these emotions. So I came up with each destructive emotion. So I had a sequence for anger, a sequence for attachment, a sequence for jealousy, and each sequence has a mantra and asana and pranayama.
How did you pick the postures? Especially for something like jealousy. Like, what would a jealous posture look like, or a posture that was combating jealousy? How would that look?
Yeah. So in the text, you'll see that like jealousy, it affects the belly, the area, the organs of the digestive system. And so I would like put some twists in the pose and the sequence that, get to that area and things like that. Like anger affects the heart, the winds at the heart, the chakra, the heart chakra. So then some back bends and poses that open this area. Like attachment affects the winds at the throat. And so some like inversions and poses that work this area. So like that. But I did like for each sequence had asana, like I mentioned, pranayama, mantra, visualizations. And I did that for myself. And then, what I noticed when I was going through this tough time in my life, I think it was about 7, 8 years ago. And at that time, some of my very close friends who are also deep practitioners of yoga, have been teaching for years, they were also going through very tough, like personal tragedies in their life, like losing loved ones or relationships falling apart. And we were talking, and they were also saying that, I have this strong asana practice, I have a strong pranayama practice, but still, like, my mind is really disturbed. Like, I'm having a hard time getting a hold of my mind and dealing with my anger and, these kinds of emotions. Mm-hmm. And so they inspired me too. And so I started sharing these sequences with my teacher friends and yogi friends. And then I actually just turned it into a training. And I'm doing what I was encouraging all of us to do, which is like go back to the level of teacher training and bring in these mind aspects of yoga into training, so that teachers have these tools and yoga is just better represented with, like, how do we work not just on the body, but how do we work on these?
Recognizing the two are together, right? I mean, it's a shame that that wasn't in Krishnamacharya's early teaching, because I think things would be very different if he were to have used mantra. I think for various reasons that wasn't the case. One reason, he was teaching very, very young boys at that time, But, then later on, I think he would have brought those things when he was teaching one-to-one, use of mantra and visualizations, etc., and postures. I mean, one problem with the Ashtanga sequences that everyone will probably point out, or many people, is that they're too fast. It's hard to keep up with a mantra and a visualization when you're racing through these dynamic sequences, right? They're really tough. But if you look at people like the Raj of Order or Appropriation, they who kind of formulated the sun salutations in the modern era, really. That's, these two people were very instrumental in popularizing the Surya Namaskar. Now, the Raj of Ord always used mantra and visualizations in going through the sun salutations, why couldn't those be brought back in? That's a very good idea. And
and I actually practice that way, and I love it. Practicing with the mantra, just the Surya Namaskar, practicing with the mantra and the subtle body awareness, and it becomes such a beautiful layered practice. And it is working at the level of the mind when we practice with the mantra. They're very empowering mantras, So that's like, sometimes I introduce people to mantra with those sun salutation mantras, but I don't
a lot of injury as well. I mean, because people won't be just pushing so much in the asana. If you've got more to think about, and yoga is expanded out of just developing the asana, and you're doing the mantra and the visualization, I think there'll be a lot less injuries generally, actually, as well.
Yeah. And it slows us down, which is nice, But when I think of like Krishnamacharya and the lineage of Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois, I wonder, one of the ways I got inspired to look at emotions is because I learned about a female yogi. Her name was Naguma, but she looked at the emotions and the subtle body in her yoga practices. And so sometimes I wonder, just most of the yoga that is popular today is from a male perspective. And I wonder if we had more female voices, and just knowing that one little bit about Naguma, like, really inspired me. Like when I went back to the Gita and the Upanishads, I think I was inspired by her. So I was like picking up those teachings about the emotions and thoughts and how to work with them. And I don't know, maybe we need more of a feminine touch, to our yoga practices.
There's certainly enough around on the yoga and the patriarchy as well, and there's some reasonable grounds to assume that we need a little bit of balance in there. Send us anything you know about Niguma. I'm sure, because the first thing is people will ask me in a comment. So if you know anything, we'll put it, and she comes back with anything, then we'll put it in the notes below. And
I'll just say we don't know. I've had that.
Don't know much.
A decade. We don't know much.
People are going to ask, aren't they? It's a shame. Because there certainly were now known female yogis practicing, but for some reason there's not much record of it. But I suppose because it was outside the established order, they would have been practicing.
Right. But there's
sadly.
enough
So,
teachings in the text that we can piece together, like what I
right.
did. We can piece together these practices on bringing in awareness of our thoughts and emotions into our practices and how to shift out of the destructive ones and, replace them with, because the texts are very clear that these kind of like certain thoughts and emotions, they take away our prana, like they drain us of our energy and we get depleted. They lead to sickness and, these things that are becoming proven by science today, that our thoughts and emotions affect our health and our vitality. That's all in these, ancient texts and quite a bit of
Yeah.
detail. So we can learn and bring them into our practices.
Yeah. I think it was great to bring that up because I think, unfortunately, I mean, I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about the use of this one quote in the Yoga Sutras because it what that does, I think, is encourage people not to look. It's complete suppression or denial of the mind body experience, right? And where yoga, if we're looking at the modern practices that we're doing, I mean, they're much more based in a tantric expression of engaging with these emotions, engaging with the body,
Yes.
engaging in the feelings of the body, and much more, let's say, gendered. I'll probably get in trouble for using the term feminine energy, but the masculine idea of repression, subjugation, and domination is on one hand the Yoga Sutras, and I'd say, on the other hand, you're absolutely right. The emotions are there, and they're to be used, I think, especially in the modern era. When we're constantly suffering. So many stimulating, and emotional states that I think that it's very helpful to phrase yoga more in that capacity. Well, I suppose we've done almost an hour. Look, it's been wonderful to chat to you. I'm always ending with a couple of questions. They're quick fire questions, and I think I haven't done this for a while, so I was trying to remember them myself. Oh, yes. What is an inspiration for you? This is it. I should know it by now. An inspiration for you, like it could be a book, a person, or place, blah, blah, blah. And we say a guilty pleasure. Let me know you're not guilty of anything. That's fine too. But, just as long as you don't say chocolate, anything can be just something which you take pleasure in life, I suppose, that isn't necessarily yoga related. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, you asked what inspires me.
Yes. Yeah.
I would say, honesty inspires me. Like, I just love, it doesn't even matter what people are saying, but if they're honest, I just find it beautiful. Even if it's like, I'm struggling with this Sanskrit word, or I don't even know if I like Sanskrit, I just love honesty. But yeah, when I see people like that's brave, especially these days where people are so sensitive and we all feel like we have to walk on eggshells. When I see someone who's just honest and brave and speaking their truth, that's just so beautiful and inspiring to me, and I'm like, yes. And I want to keep doing that and do it more when I see people doing that. What else?
You have to write a new article, don't you? You have to keep writing those. I think you said you were going to write more, and I haven't found any more. Write some more articles.
Oh, yeah. My daughter and her friends inspire me. I can see how. This is not politically correct to say, but I just talked about bravery. So, I can see that they really like all that matters is what's in their hearts. It doesn't matter. Like if you see my daughter and her friends, they're all different races and backgrounds. And it's just like, they don't see that. It doesn't matter. It's just like they connect heart from heart, heart to heart. And I'm like, can we do that again as adults? And and I feel like all spiritual teachings are just, they have that in common, that it's the energy that matters, like just being loving and compassionate, understanding and forgiving. And I see how easily my daughter and her friends make mistakes and hurt each other and then forgive and talk and laugh. And, so it's beautiful to be able to witness that. One of my guilty pleasures is I love to make popcorn, and I make all these I put all these fun little things in the popcorn to make it tasty. And my daughter and I will just watch Harry Potter and just cuddle up. And even though we've watched the whole I think it's 7 or 8 movies, we watched the whole series multiple times.
Oh, really? Right.
We just like, that's our favorite thing to do, like evening time. We'll just like make popcorn, cuddle up, watch Harry Potter for the 100th time. And it feels like a guilty pleasure. What kind of fun things
do you put in the popcorn? That sounds fun.
I put like spices.
Okay, right. Kind of like a masala popcorn. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like a masala popcorn.
Yeah. Cool.
And I feel guilty. I feel guilty because I feel like, oh, I could use this time to like get my daughter to practice the piano or harmonium or sing mantra.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Oh, I know.
I'm like, no,
nice.
let's just watch it.
Well, thanks for coming on. And for any further notes, look at the notes below. It's been a pleasure, Reema, to chat to you today. And I hope to see you and see more of your work online again, because I think your voice is needed in this current era.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun to talk.
Been a great chat. Thanks.
Thank you.